Welcome to a new workshop about the data director. Today I'd like to tell you about the new things for exports with the data director and as a new way to execute exports, I want to tell you what grid exports are and how they work. For this I have prepared my Pimcore with the files in the repository to have some example data. I have an import for manufacturers, which created some manufacturer objects, and I have an import for the products, which created product objects. And then as the third data port, I have an export data port. Essentially, exports work the same as I've shown in the other video, but I've added a little extension to that. As before, you define the fields which you want to export as raw data fields, and everything above here stays the same. Source type is Pimcore object, for example. Target class is export, and the source data class in our case is kosher product. And of course, you can define a filter condition if you do not want to export all objects of this source data class. Now, when you have defined all those raw data fields, then you have to say what you want to do or define the format of the export document. And as before, we do that in the result callback function. For common use cases, we have some predefined templates to be used. So for example, XML, JSON, CSV with or without assets. So for our use case, let's use a simple CSV. And when the function which is generated here now contains those elements here with double curly braces, and then there is name, a label, for example. And this construct will generate so-called virtual fields in the attribute mapping. So this means as soon as I save, you will see it. For all those fields in the double curly braces, we now have virtual fields. And for those fields, automatically the raw data fields, which we, with the same name, get applied here. But now, that's the difference compared to the previous approach, you now have the option to apply callback functions to those single fields without changing the result callback function. So when we, for example, want for the SKU to apply a certain prefix, because our target system needs that, we can just apply it here without having to change anything in the result callback function. So this stays the same. Here the SKU is still the same, but we'll see in a minute that this prefix or this callback function gets applied for the field SKU. This also has the advantage that you do not have to export all the fields which you extract from the Pimcore data objects, but perhaps you extract some only for some logic which you want to implement in the callback functions. For example, we could change our callback function for the SKU with the prefix to be only used, so the prefix should only be prepended if the Pimcore ID starts with digit 4. So let's try to implement this. And first, I'd like to remove the ID from the export. For this, I simply remove this virtual field here in the result callback function. Then immediately the ID disappears, but we still can use ID in the raw data item ID in the callback function of other fields. So you see it here, params raw item data still contains the field ID. And let's implement the logic. If the first digit of, let's copy it, of raw item data ID is a 4. Then use the prefix, otherwise use the SKU of the data object itself, so without the prefix. So let's check that. Now we see ABC is still prefixed because the ID of our first raw data item begins with 4, but we'll see in a second that for other items whose ID does not begin with 4, it will be the unprefixed SKU. Now when we execute this export, we will see that the column ID is not present anymore, but our custom logic for the field SKU will get applied. So wait a second. There it is. Let's open it. Now we see the first field is key. There is no ID field anymore. Also, if we scroll through the list, there is no ID field. And for the SKU, we see that the prefix got applied for all, different to see here, for all the items which have whose ID begins with 416 with 4. For example, 20 dresses brown, Daya collections. We see those here. And for the other objects which are at the bottom here, whose IDs begin with 1, for example, those their SKUs do not begin with the prefix. Column I, right. Those have the original SKUs as in the data objects. So this is a change, that you do not have to export all the fields which you extract from the data objects, and that you can add custom logic to the field data by the callback functions for the virtual fields, as you know from the imports. So now we executed the import with the manual way for with the run export panel and the start complete export button. But in the meantime, we have added another method to start exports, and this is with the grid. The grid has the advantage that you can simply, or rather, for most field types it's simple, you can use those filters. For example, when you want to filter for a name which contains 612, then you can simply use the filter. Now this is also usable for people who do not have any experience with SQL, for example, or other who are not programmers but who are normal users. And we implemented a way to use this simple grid filtering and also grid selection in combination with the exports of the data director. For this, we have added a drop-down menu item here under the CSV export split button, which is named data director. When we click that, then we see a little hint or a little window with a hint this hint says that no matter which columns or fields are displayed in the grid currently, the actual structure of the export document is still defined in the result callback function of the data port. So we use the grid only for filtering and selecting, but the actual document which gets output gets defined in the data port. When we, for example, we filtered for this name all the products who contain name with 612 somewhere, then we can select the data port to be used for export, and we can select the language. I'll come to that in a second, and press OK. And afterwards we will get an export file, and it contains only the data for those objects which we filtered. Now we can even more filter those with the selection here at the front. Everything works the same as with the normal Pimcore export, but I'll come to the advantages which this data director implementation has. When we select those two and execute it again, select data port again, then we'll see that only those two get exported. All right. And now I'd like to come to the advantages which this implementation of the grid export has compared to the Pimcore built-in export. I've also written this down here, the problems with Pimcore's built-in export functionality. At first, there is no predefined filters possible. So for example, when you could, for example, also set up the different fields to be exported with the safe grid, for example. But when we reload that, then we'll see that the set filters will not get used. You see it, the 612 filter on name got unset, or is not used anymore. With the data director, of course, you can do that, because the filter condition you use here also applies for grid filters. So for example, when you would, you could implement a grid filter to only export published objects, right? Published equals 1. We unpublish this first object, and now we export those two with the data director. Then we will see that only one gets exported. This is because the other object is now unpublished, and as our filter condition only allows published objects to be exported, in the result there will be only one item in the export. Another advantage of the data director implementation is that you are really limited to CSV export and Excel export with the Pimcore built-in method. With the data director, you can really easy use all those other template functions. For example, when we add another data port, product export JSON, and just export this and import it here. And change the result callback function to another template, for example the JSON, then you can easily output also JSON files. But not only the file extension changes, but you can also implement really custom logic. So for example, you can implement an export which sends the data to an API or something like that, and start this with the filtered set of objects from the grid. Let's do that for here. Let's go back to the product grid. Let's take those three. And you'll see that we now have also the JSON export. Selected those three. We export it. We have the JSON export with those three selected items. One important topic for this list of available data ports is that this is already filtered for the class of objects which gets displayed in the grid. So for example, the current folder only contains kosher product objects, and our target class for our data port is also kosher product. But when we go to the grid of the manufacturers, you see here are all the kosher manufacturer objects, and go to that point here, then you see the data. There are no data ports available which are compatible with this with the current grid view. This is furthermore filtered by objects. If there are no objects which match the filter condition in the opened grid or in the opened folder, then the export will also not be available. So, but there's even more. You've just seen that you can select the language which shall be used for the data to be exported. When you have localized fields, so let's look at the class definition for kosher product. When you have a localized field like name, then you can in the data port raw data field use it either as name, or you can use name #DE or #EN for the language to be used. When you only use name, then you can adjust the name in the moment of the request. So when we leave it as this is, and let's look at an object here. The English name I imported originally, but for a German name I just prefixed DE. Of course, we could have translated this with the DeepL API, which I've shown before, but for now I just prefixed this DE. And when we request an export for those three objects, let's take the CSV export again in English, as we did before. Then we see the name is this. And when we request an export in German, then we'll see that the DE gets prefixed. So this is now the German name and the other one was the English name. So this way you can implement multi-language exports from the grid. And another advantage of the data director implementation for grid export is that you can define what to do with the export document. So of course it's a common use case to get the download file or the export document as a download file, but there could be other use cases where you, for example, want to send data to an API. For example, you want to export data from your Pimcore to an online shop with the API, or you want to send the exported data, upload the exported document via FTP to some other server. This would not be possible with the built-in functionality, but it is with Data Director. For example, when you go to the CSV again, we could say that the result document action should be to save the export document as an asset. When we do so, we get additional virtual fields, namely response document asset file name and response document asset target path. As the file name for our asset to be saved, let's take export.csv, and as a target path we create folder exports, for example, folder, and then use that here as a target path. And now when we execute this export again with the grid, CSV data port, then we'll see that when we refresh our folder, there's our export CSV file, and when we download it, when we download it and open it, then we see that this is our data which we want to export. It's those three items here. As a last point, I'd like to mention that this is not only possible for folder grids, but it's also possible for the child tables when you have an object hierarchy. For example, when you have a hierarchy like this, and let's refresh that, Then you have this children grid here. For this grid, the same applies. Here is the data director, and when we, let's take the JSON export, when we export it with the children grid, again, the same functionality applies as for the folder grid. When we export this, and we get the JSON of the two child items which were shown in the grid. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you find this grid exports feature useful. And if you have any questions, just write us and we will answer you as soon as possible. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.